Please, for our next session, join me to welcome Ariel, who will be speaking to us about 6 years in review, transforming company culture to embrace risk. Ariel.
Thank you everyone for attending my talk. I'm excited to take you on a 6-year journey of a single program that transformed company culture. My name's Ariel, and I'm a product security engineering manager at Twilio. I started my career off as a pen tester, then I worked in AppSec at One Medical, then AppSec at Segment, which got acquired by Twilio. I've now been at Twilio for almost 3 years, and I manage the product security reactive team. We focus on securing the second half of the SDLC and preventing vulnerabilities from becoming incidents. A quick breakdown of what we'll discuss today. I'll share some context. What is vulnerability management and why does it matter? I'll take you on Twilio and Segment's 6-year journey. Then I'll discuss the stages of a vulnerability management program, one of which is a democratized approach. I'll discuss the components of a democratized approach and answer if this approach even works. Then I'll wrap things up and leave some time for questions. Disclaimer, we all work in security, so you all know I can't tell you everything. Names have been changed to protect the innocent. Metrics have been fictionalized due to lack of company approval, but it's very fitting since I'm presenting on this gigantic screen used to share movies, so treat this like you're watching any movie based off of a true story. Some of it's true, some of it's fake for drama and to prevent me from getting sued. Let's dive in on everyone's favorite topic. What is vulnerability management? Microsoft has a very standard definition. It's a risk-based approach to discovering, prioritizing, and remediating vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. Why do we need this? For a lot of folks in this room, vulnerability management is a noisy, never-ending ticketing system. The backlog continues to grow as more tickets come in every day, and you never have enough time to tackle it all. This program is a massive undertaking, but one you need to manage the chaos. You create a workflow or a process so that you can act quickly, communicate clearly, and prevent an incident before it's too late. If you work at a public company, your CISO may have also asked you to build or expand your vulnerability management program so they can properly disclose exploited vulnerabilities in their AK. What is democratized vulnerability management? You may have heard me say democratized one too many times in the agenda. At Segment and at Twilio, we call our vulnerability management process Democratized Vulnerability Management, or DVM for short. And this differs from a traditional vulnerability management program because we shift the responsibility and accountability of vulnerabilities from the security team to engineering teams. If you're a bit skeptical of how we do this, don't worry, we'll dive into that during this talk, which is a great segue for the next question. What is the goal of this talk? My goal is to convince you that democratizing your vulnerability management process is an effective way to scale security. Vulnerabilities will be a constant for engineers. A security team must build a strong security culture by empowering engineers to own risk. Let's travel back in time to 2018. 6 years ago, Segment launched DVM. And this program found a lot of success at Segment. Engineers and leaders were engaged in driving down risk. As the company grew from 300 to 450, the security team continued to iterate and grow this program. Twilio acquired Segment, and in 2021, our security teams merged. I started at Segment's security team for about 6 months before I started supporting Twilio, and I observed that engineers would wait for security engineers to chase them down when they breached SLA. And this was because the process was so complicated. There were 3 different processes depending on which security engineer identified the vulnerability. And you couldn't measure breached SLAs for all vulnerabilities present at Twilio. Segment had a strong security culture and a strong track record of success. Twilio engineers often ignored security vulnerabilities, and you couldn't measure the state of all vulnerabilities. We strongly believe that democratizing vulnerability management was important for scaling security at Twilio. We launched DVM at Twilio 2 years ago, and I live to tell this tale. Not only did we find success in our vulnerability management program, but we also had interest from other teams in joining forces to democratize more than just our vulnerabilities and include risks and post-incident action items. Today, our program continues to reach new heights as it has become a core component of our company culture. Instead of ignoring risk, our engineers embrace risk. And this culture shift is not only evident through faster remediation timelines, but also in the inclusion of security in everyday engineering discussions and roadmaps. The format of this talk is going through the iterations of a vulnerability management program, why we chose to iterate to reach our current state. Stage 1, you start with spreadsheets to track all of your data. And we've all been here. There may be more than one spreadsheet, and you don't have a single method or format for reporting vulnerabilities, but this will do for now as you focus on more pressing issues. Generally, you move from spreadsheets to an official system as a natural outcome of a company maturing and needing to scale. You may have received an influx of emails to your security or a friendly nudge from your compliance team. And the key feature in this transition is that you move to a single system, most often a ticketing system. You now have a traditional vulnerability management program. And you may have observed that your security engineers are burnt out from chasing engineers, breached SLAs, and a general lack of investment from engineering. As your backlog continues to grow, scaling becomes your #1 priority, so you move over to a democratized approach. When we launched a democratized approach at Segment, our program had 4 pillars. The first pillar is engineers own risk and are accountable for vulnerabilities. Our features explicitly call this out, that engineers own risk. Vulnerability tickets are assigned to risk owners instead of assignees, and risk owners are engineering managers or product managers responsible for the risk of a product or service. Our second pillar is self-service due date extensions. Since engineers own risk, our default process allows engineers to request due date extensions with their engineering VP, director, or themselves, depending on the severity of the ticket. This means that if an engineering team can't fix a high priority vulnerability, they would work with their leadership team to get an extension. Leaders are a lot more accountable for vulnerabilities in their org when they put their name on each vulnerability. Our third pillar is transparency and vulnerability reporting. In addition to a description of the vulnerability, you include the severity description. Why was this vulnerability prioritized as a P1 instead of a P2, a critical instead of a high? This means that engineers can review these tickets and negotiate the severity. You also provide a criteria for remediation. You clarify explicitly what the expectation is for engineers to mark a ticket as remediated. Our fourth pillar is visible and meaningful metrics that you report on to drive accountability within the engineering org. At Segment, monthly emails were sent out to engineering on the debt within the org and action items to drive down that debt. These 4 pillars guided our program successfully at Segment. Engineers own risk, self-service due date extensions, transparent vulnerability reporting, and visible metrics. We were so confident that this program would succeed at Twilio. This program was built to scale, and we were ready to tackle 17x growth. However, when we launched this program at Twilio, the pillars started to crack. We had scale challenges we hadn't experienced before. Not only was Twilio a much larger organization with many mergers and acquisitions, Twilio had a completely different culture. And I can feel these pillars crumbling on top of me for many months. I was being crushed, and I felt that this project was impossible. With time and an amazing team beside me, we were able to add a few more pillars and strengthen our program and accomplish the impossible. Let's dive into where things can go wrong and how we can overcome those challenges. First up is leadership buy-in. Leadership buy-in is crucial to the success of your democratized vulnerability management program. Vulnerabilities are resource intensive, so leadership buy-in ensures that you have the resources to build out this program effectively. A democratized program requires folks to be engaged with security, so leadership buy-in helps drive accountability and build trust. At Twilio, we faced many different types of challenges when it came to leadership buy-in that we hadn't experienced before at Segment. Segment not only had a smaller leadership group, but one that was also more aligned with a democratized approach. The stakeholders that constitute your leadership group can vary depending on your organizational structure, but generally includes at the highest levels, your CISO, head of security, VP of security, and at the lower levels, all of the leaders of teams that own parts of the vulnerability management lifecycle. This can be the manager of the vulnerability management team, the risk team, the security platform team, and all of the teams that report vulnerabilities from their tooling, such as product security and cloud security. When we were preparing to launch DVM at Twilio, we faced a lot of initial resistance from the cloud security team, the risk team, and the vulnerability management team. Twilio had just acquired Segment, and we were coming in to make changes to existing programs. A lot of folks felt that we were coming in very opinionated with big changes to an organization we didn't understand. And this was true. We didn't understand Twilio fully, and yet we held strong beliefs that DVM was the only way to scale this program. We conducted interviews across security and engineering and shared out an initial report of the current state of vulnerability management, the pain points, and how a democratized approach can solve it. The report conclusion was met with a lot of pushback, and we utilized a two-pronged approach. First, we relied on our bought-in leaders to create buy-in with additional leaders. We had high-level leadership support due to in part with the CISO coming from Segment, so we relied on the CISO to influence other leaders and encourage them to move forward with DVM. While leaders were bought in at a high level, there were still questions and concerns we had to resolve. Our second approach was that we adapted our message to the different managers to the group and strived to resolve their concerns. Cloud security had very tactical concerns. They wanted to see a workflow and understand the engineering resources needed when committing to a project like this. They also wanted a pilot to be conducted. As an engineering team, they wanted to test the solution before buying into it. The Vuln management team, on the other hand, had concerns about big picture. What is the vision of this program, and how would our policies and standards adapt? The risk team had a lot of skepticism, so we relied on evidence from the Segments program to build trust. They didn't trust that our program could accurately capture risk, so we worked on showing that not only can this program reduce risk, but it will also free up time for them to focus on larger risk initiatives instead of just individual risk tickets. In total, we created around 42 documents, 3 slide decks over 3 quarters to get the necessary leadership buy-in for this program. While this was an expensive step, this was a key requirement for ensuring that this program was set up for success. In summary, some challenges you might face is a lack of alignment with the democratized approach. And this could be because they don't understand it fully, teams may be resistant to change, or teams may be against centralizing due to the need to share resources, especially if teams are siloed. There may be complex bureaucratic processes for obtaining approval, and this is true for some larger organizations. There may be high turnover in leadership positions. Oftentimes we hear that CISOs change annually, and this is one big consequence of that. If your leadership group changes, you have to regain that buy-in. Leadership may also have competing priorities that take precedent over the vulnerability management program, making it challenging to secure their attention and commitment to this program. Our solutions are to adapt your message to the different types of leaders in your group, whether that's tactical, vision, or evidence. Showcase your successes and outcomes to engage leaders. Don't just share your intentions, speak to the business outcomes that leaders care about. Identify and leverage your influential allies, and understand that leadership buy-in is the most important step. Do not move forward without it. Next up is engineering buy-in. Now that security leadership is on board, your next step is to get your engineers on board. Generally, your engineering group consists of engineering managers, directors, VPs, and your early adopters can also include staff engineers. I wanted to share 2 stories that represent the extreme end of our engineering buy-in spectrum. Bob really embraced our approach and was able to move faster than we could. He was a champion for our program in many ways. He filled in the gaps with ownership in our org, he provided feedback through each iteration, and he created dashboards that ultimately became the design for future dashboards rolled out to all of engineering. Most importantly, he showed us a path forward for other engineering leaders like him to stay accountable. He held weekly meetings to talk through security vulnerabilities with other engineering leads, fostering a culture of collaboration and shared responsibility. He was the best supporter we could have asked for. He not only voiced support for our program, but he played a pivotal role in guiding adoption at Twilio. Alice, on the other hand, was really resistant. She had heard that security was launching this democratized approach and told us, in other words, that this project will fail. Engineers are going to ignore tickets being created in a centralized project. We should instead be creating tickets in a backlog, or else the team will never get the work done. We ultimately moved forward without Alice's approval, and it's important to understand that not every single engineer will be on board. This can feel really scary because engineering support is a good predictor of adoption. We chose to proceed without 100% engineering buy-in because we had strong backing from influential engineering leaders and leadership. We faced an additional challenge of engaging leaders when it came to scale. When I was supporting Segment, I could hop on a Zoom call to hash out a security concern with an engineer, and it was no problem. At a company of 8,000 and a 100-person security team, that was no longer possible. We introduced the concept of a BSO, or a business unit CISO, so that each engineering org would have a security representative. One of the responsibilities of a BSO was to lead a weekly operational trust review meeting. This is a weekly meeting in which engineering leads sync with their security representatives on their top security risk. This group would review dashboards of all of the vulnerabilities present within their BU, and leaders would provide context on remediation timelines and their engineering bandwidth. For instance, they might tell us, hey, we need to reprioritize security issues for this month as we focus on migrating off this end-of-life service. BSOs would also work with engineering leads to identify tickets without owners. And lastly, this was an opportunity for security to get continuous feedback from engineering leads. In summary, some challenges you might face is engineers may be resistant to change. They may be comfortable with the current process, and a new process requires more work and no guarantee that it will improve anything. Lack of incentives with a demanding workflow. Engineers may not see the direct benefits or incentives of actively participating in a vulnerability management program. Without clear incentives or rewards for their involvement, engineering buy-in can be challenging. This new change was communicated poorly. Folks may be confused or skeptical about this process. Some of the methods that we used to engage our engineers was getting input from engineers early and often during our transition to a democratized program. We wrote down their pain points, resolved them, and followed up with them. And this helped us find our early adopters like Bob, who helped adapt our program to Twilio's size and culture. Once again, Bob helped us create the early designs for our dashboards. We created different dashboards depending on the roles. Engineering had dashboards that showed tickets assigned to them, and engineering leaders had more high-level dashboards on trends and top risks. The role of the BSO, or the mini CISO, helped us develop key partnerships with engineering leads and our weekly operational trust review meetings. With the support of Bob, we expanded those weekly meetings to additional business units so that engineering leaders could chat about top security vulnerabilities and risks with a security partner. You've now created buy-in with your leadership group and a few engineers, and now you have to bring awareness to the entire company. When you try to get engineers involved with a new program, process, or tool, it's very similar to a marketing concept called the buyer journey. The buyer journey is when you're trying to acquire a new customer. It's important to adapt your message and your resources depending on where your customer is in the buying journey. If your customer base is unaware of your product, it doesn't make sense for you to launch a loyalty product through a buy 9, get 10th product free. Instead, you need to focus on building awareness through billboards, ads, sometimes even cold calls to ensure that your customer is aware of you. When we first started to plan to launch the newest iteration of vulnerability management, we copied the same exact playbook from Segment. We sent out a Slack message like this one pictured here to an engineering-wide channel. We sent out an email to all engineers. We created a primer on how this new process worked. And in each ticket, we included instructions how to follow the process and engage with security. We even took one additional step. We created a 4-minute demo that replicated the primer for our audio-visual learners across our global teams. We patted ourselves on the back and checked off create awareness in our checklist. We observed a couple of signals that our work was not yet done. You can see in this Slack message, we have 6 reactions, 5 of which was from security, and 1 was a software engineering intern. So thank you, Kevin, the intern. We also received a lot of comments that they didn't understand how this process worked or questions that were already answered in our primer. After we recognized that our initial awareness efforts had no impact on engineering, we decided to go on a roadshow to all 32 business units at Twilio. We had a 10-minute presentation prepared that walked through the workflow and frequently asked questions. And this presentation just really reflected the primer, but we found success at Twilio because Twilio has a strong meeting culture. Other methods like email and Slack had become white noise, so this was our only effective tool that allowed us to create the awareness we needed. For some of the business units, this was the first time that they ever had the opportunity to speak with security. They felt ignored, so showing up to their meetings showed that we cared and went a long way in building goodwill. In summary, some challenges you might face in creating awareness is complexity. A new vulnerability management process can seem complex and hard to digest for large audiences, especially if they don't feel engaged. For larger and more diverse audiences, it can be a logistical nightmare and time-consuming to tailor each awareness campaign to suit everyone's needs. Finding a consistent and impactful communication channel to engage a diverse audience can be challenging. Should you use a Slack channel, an email distro, or 30+ engineering meetings? And awareness efforts are not always scalable. Maintaining interest, engagement, and focus on vulnerability management requires continuous effort and resources that may not always be readily available at scale. Our solutions were that we utilized our primer, those wiki articles, instructions, and recordings. While they had a limited reach, it ensured that we had one consistent method that was accessible to everyone. We leaned on our leadership team to socialize our new process, and our most successful avenue in creating awareness was a roadshow. A democratized approach requires engaged participants. Next up is ownership. In order to remediate a vulnerability, you need to know who is responsible for fixing that vulnerability. This is an intimidating and a thankless task for many. Like many in the tech industry, we were affected by the layoffs. We were dealing with the impact of the news while getting alerts on inactive owners all across our org. We were struggling to keep up with the ownership changes or the absence of any new information on who the new owners are. Oftentimes, we just couldn't find an owner, and the ticket would stay with the security team and need security triage, meaning it was up to security to find the new owner. One of the core pillars of DVM is that engineers own risk, and that means they own the risk for not having a clear owner for their product or service. This should be on engineering to find the new owner, not on security. In practice, we would often see behaviors like this, where engineering teams would push a ticket back to need security triage. Happened more than a few times. It actually happened quite often. The security team would try to keep up with the changes, but we were manually writing down owners. Our information was going stale at a rapid rate. We have a help channel in which we would constantly get flooded with messages like this. This ticket isn't mine. How do I get my name off of it? And we received a lot of recommendations from engineers and leaders to throw security resources at a band-aid solution for the ownership problem. But it was important for us to ensure that this was a problem engineering solved. Instead, we socialized the ownership problem by letting engineering leads know how many hours were spent finding accurate owners and how those delays pushed off remediation and led to breached SLAs. Luckily, we found some great engineering partners. 1 year ago, Segment cleaned up their ownership information in a queryable catalog and created a Jira integration for us to use this data in our security tickets. And this was huge. You can see in the first ticket, Patrick is trying to get his name off a ticket in the morning, and then in the afternoon, he had signed up to solve the ownership problem for all Segment vulnerability tickets. All we have to do now is include an asset in a vulnerability ticket, and ownership information auto-populates and auto-refreshes. To this day, this is my favorite feature. I do want to call that this is something we currently only have at Segment. We're continuing to influence Twilio, but this is difficult to do as most individual engineering managers do not care about the cost of the entire ownership problem for all of engineering. This makes it really difficult to shift the ownership problem to engineering. When you interact with an individual engineering manager, they just want you to take their name off of a ticket that they know doesn't belong to them. And you want them to help you find the right engineering manager and influence their org to provide clear and accurate ownership data. There are a couple of challenges with ownership that probably feel familiar to many of you. Ambiguous owners. If there are multiple teams that own a product, a service has been deprecated, a reorg, or you just don't know who the owner is or why. Turnover, your previous owner no longer works at the company. You have no idea how to find this new owner. Lastly, it's individual engineering managers do not bear sole responsibility for the lack of clear ownership, so it's difficult to motivate action for the greater good. Our two solutions won't solve all of your problems, but this helped us trend towards the right direction. Attribute ownership upwards. This tends to be more stable during reorgs and departures, and quantify the ownership problem. What is the cost of not having clear owners for every single vulnerability ticket, not being able to assign tickets quickly? Socialize those costs to engineering leaders to influence more structure and organization around ownership. The ownership problem is not up to security to fix, but it is our job to advocate for an engineering solution. Our last pillar is noise. A vulnerability management program tries to create some order amongst all of the noise, but there's still too much noise. The more security tooling you add, the more noise you add. The more people ignore you, the more noise you create to get their attention. How do you make noise less noisy? How do you make folks pay attention when they've started to block out all of the noise? We had received this message from a VP who had received 70 emails in 2 months. We'd actually purposely did this. We had set up our email notifications so that if you were not triaging and remediating your tickets in a timely manner, you and your leadership chain would continue to get emails. This wasn't just Joe. Many individuals had flooded inboxes as they were experiencing the growing pains of transitioning from a culture in which ignoring tickets was tolerated to a culture in which you needed to actively engage and address tickets in a timely and consistent manner. With a huge backlog of debt, engineering wasn't going to fix all of this overnight. We were going to further alienate the individuals who already had a strained relationship with security, or this was going to strain the relationship for us. Before we can even improve how we notify in a large volume, we had to reduce the volume for an organization that was just regularly starting to tackle their debt. As a security organization, we chose to prioritize the remediation of critical and high vulnerabilities, our P1s and our P2s. We would build a security muscle for the most pressing issues and then expand our focus to lower severity issues, our P3s and P4s. Many of you may be thinking, that's exactly where my program is at and there's no end in sight. This is in part due to the law of diminishing returns. The first slice of chocolate cake is a joy to consume. That 9th or 10th slice is downright miserable. P1s are easy to get attention on and remediate quickly. P3s and P4s are difficult to get any movement on. As we worked on building a security muscle and encouraging engineers to embrace risk, we not only saw a reduction in criticals and highs, but also a reduction in our mediums and lows. Engineers started to include security fixes in their workflows and roadmaps, and we would see comments like this in the engineering team room. Our goal is not to ignore lower severity findings forever. Our goal is to build a muscle so that engineers own risk and sustainably drive down their debt. We also had to help these poor inboxes out. We created a Slack bot digest that allows us to group all tickets pending action on an individual and send just one message. This feature is still in development, but we're hoping that this makes noise become less noisy. In summary, some challenges we face is that engineers are overwhelmed by the high volume of findings because they don't have the bandwidth to handle them all. If they're used to ignoring security issues, this feeling is multiplied as they have this new work and no additional resources. Due to a lack of context for most automated tooling, tickets may be misprioritized, they may be false positives, they may be duplicates, and this causes strain on both security and engineering, since security spends a lot of time during security triage, and engineers feel like they're wasting time investigating non-existent issues. When security continues to ring that fire alarm again and again, engineers become fatigued by the constant fires. Engineers start to mistrust the impact of security vulnerabilities, and the law of diminishing returns comes into play as engineers have burned themselves out on the first batch of critical vulnerabilities and are tired or no longer have the resources to remediate medium and low severity issues. Engineers may lack the motivation or the incentives to address all security issues reported to them, and they may feel that there's a minimal impact to their performance evaluation or to the company to resolve all of the issues. Why fix all of the vulnerabilities when your director's only looking at the criticals? Our solutions are to reduce noise for engineers, and that's clear prioritization, reporting P1s and P2s so that folks build out their muscle. Improve the signal to noise ratio. And there are many methods you can do this. We have fine-tuning tooling, defining a standard for creating tickets, improving ticket quality during security triage before it goes out to engineering, and including a score for ticket quality. This can be a measure of confidence so that you can attribute delays in remediation to poor ticket quality in conversations with engineering. Adapt your reporting and notification methods to your audience. This is knowing when to use email versus Slack. We generally use Slack for notifications and emails for escalation. Using a digest instead of individual notifications. Tools like Jira tend to only allow you ticket by ticket, so build an automation that allows you to group tickets by an individual. Similarly, using a dashboard to motivate bulk action. Next is regular security hygiene activities to build out that security muscle. Lastly, it's creating a recognition program and culture. Segment had gamified security culture in which teams were rewarded for security activities, and this helped encourage folks to care about all security vulnerabilities. That was a lot of recommendations I threw out at you. I have a lot of strong opinions after working on this one program for many years. The key takeaway here, though, is that you iterate on reducing noise and to have empathy for engineers as they grow and adapt to this process. These new pillars became the democratized vulnerability management program for Twilio. In addition to the 4 pillars we borrowed from Segment, we included leadership buy-in, engineering buy-in, awareness, ownership, and noise. We had launched the democratized program at 2 companies of different sizes and cultures. Does a democratized approach work? One way to measure this is through metrics. We hadn't launched CVM at Twilio when Log4j hit in late 2021. We didn't have an easy way to track all of our repos, and many of our known repos were in an unknown state of remediation. Many people spent many manual hours confirming that we tracked all repos at Twilio and our M&As, confirming if a repo was affected by Log4j, and confirming if we'd remediated it. We can compare that to any 0 day that hit us in 2023, where we could spin up a dashboard like this on day 1. We not only had coverage of all affected assets at Twilio, but we could see a downward trend of affected assets as engineering burned down risk quickly and efficiently. Beyond a single incident, we can look at a burn down chart of all vulnerabilities present in the org. Before we launched DVM, a dashboard like this wasn't even possible. When we first launched DVM, we see in the first few months that most tickets had breached and very few tickets were closed within SLA. As time progressed, we saw more tickets close within SLA and fewer tickets close outside of SLA. To many folks, they saw this as a sign of definitive success. Finally, we're getting engineers to burn down risk. But metrics don't capture the full story, and the plot thickens. We had solved a lot of challenges, but oftentimes I would complain that this program had become a monster. In Greek mythology, a hydra is a monster in which you cut one head off, 2 more grow. In security, you report 1 vulnerability and then 2 more get reported. This program is effective at getting engineers to fix security issues. When you have an effective program that gets engineers to do security work that's been previously ignored, it's easy to keep adding more and more vulnerabilities. This was our effective hammer, so we were going to use a hammer for all of our problems. All of the elements that make it easier for engineers and engineering leaders to embrace risk had actually created this terrible, powerful ticketing monster. At any cost, this monster was going to maximize vulnerability remediation. And with its growing heads, it had eyes everywhere. It could see every engineer and every engineering manager not rising up to be the perfect security partner. This is also in part due to the great metrics we were reporting out. To prevent this monster from destroying our program, we had to build our program on a foundation, a culture of trust. This foundation remains for any program that adopts a democratized approach, whether you have more, fewer, or even different pillars. This is the most important element you must safeguard. A culture of trust is a culture where you are confident in your organization to act with good intention. This culture fosters an atmosphere where folks feel empowered and their opinions are valued and respected. As a security engineer, you're not fearful that engineers will leave your organization vulnerable. You trust your engineers to protect the company. Maximizing vulnerability remediation is inherently at odds with giving folks the autonomy and responsibility to remediate vulnerabilities. The goal of a democratized vulnerability management program is that you give engineers the autonomy to own their vulnerabilities. If they're slow to remediate a vulnerability, that's their decision, and it's our job to encourage and motivate them to want to care about security. If the only goal of leadership is to burn down vulnerabilities as fast as possible, it's a short-sighted goal. You can only ring that fire alarm so many times before folks start to distrust you and burn out. Remember, it's easy to break trust. It's hard to rebuild. Building and demonstrating a culture of trust is hard to do. Metrics aren't easy to capture around a culture evolving. However, you can share stories of cultural change alongside your dashboards. A couple of stories at Twilio that I'm really proud to share are our developer enablement team came to the security team to solve the ownership problem with a centralized software catalog and a Jira integration. A 0-day incident was resolved before the security team even came online. We didn't need to create a single ticket because engineers had proactively secured the organization. The security team adopted those weekly meetings from engineering, as engineering leaders were already meeting weekly to prioritize security vulnerabilities into their sprints and quarterly roadmaps. Engineering is currently exploring adding security as a key requirement for their engineering career development plans. And lastly, remember Alice and Bob. Alice returned 1 year later. She had reached out to engineering about building a new process for reporting action items to engineering after an incident. Engineering pushed on Alice to adopt a process similar to DVM due to its success and appeal. I was extremely happy when Alice reached out and also a little bit vindicated. But I truly saw the culture shift before my own eyes. Twilio engineers were embracing risk in the DVM program. In summary, some challenges you may face is culture is continuously evolving. It's hard to define your desired culture and define the next steps you need to take to get there. It's a lot more difficult to measure and report on culture change, especially with limited tools like engagement surveys, which in my opinion, don't do a great job of evaluating or assessing your current culture. A culture transformation demands constant investment and effort. It's not a one-time activity, and it's not always clear what that next step needs to be. Our solutions are to regularly report on stories of cultural change alongside your metrics. Security engineering's job is now to create that culture change. Trust your engineers to make the right decision. And this is hard to do. Going back to control and scare tactics are easier in the short term, but trusting your engineers is better for the long term. Security is a muscle that needs to be built over time, so keep folks accountable and engaged through security hygiene activities and recognizing your good partners. After the success of DVM amongst engineering teams, they pushed on the risk and the SRE teams to utilize their approach for how they handle enterprise risks and reliability incidents. Thus, our latest stage in vulnerability management is uniting with other teams to standardize how we prioritize and report vulnerabilities, risks, and post-incident action items to engineering. We formed a group called Resilience Operations, where our goal is to stop competing with each other for engineering time and instead communicate and collaborate with one another and engineering to resolve the most pressing issues to the organization. To wrap things up, we go back to one of our original questions. Why do we need vulnerability management? It isn't just a system for creating tickets. Vulnerability management is a tool to drive security and ownership change. It's about creating a culture shift so that engineers not only own risk, but they embrace risk. Thank you to all the folks who gave me feedback during my dry run. Thank you to all the vulnerabilities that made this presentation possible. Thank you to the B-Sides organizers.
Thank you, Ariel. We have a question for you. It's what types of education was needed for the adoption of DVM across engineering teams?
What was the last piece? Of engineering teams. Okay.
Yes.
So it was just how to use the process. It wasn't necessarily that this was super difficult to do, but it was different from the previous process. So we had changed a couple of fields. The workflow had looked different. There were a couple of new terms like risk owner, due date extensions. When you have a really large audience, we found that they weren't engaged, so they didn't understand or know any of it. And so when they got a ticket assigned to them, they're just like, what is this? In the ticket comments, please get this name off, like get my name off this ticket, or like fix this, I'm stuck on something. They weren't reading our primers, so that's why we had to go to each business unit to walk through the workflow, answer frequently asked questions, and basically just point them towards the resources.
Do you have time for more questions?
Is there more time?
No, it's because I know you need to one. If we have any more questions, this is the...
Do you have a question, if you have time?
Yeah.
Okay, so coming from engineering, that side, that's what I represent, managerial.
Could you ask him on the mic, so that...
Can you hear me or no?
I can hear, but I think it's for the recording.
For the...
While you're asking, I'm going to flash this screen that I'm
Sure, I'll try
legally
to be
required
fast.
to flash.
Coming from engineering, as a manager, DevSecOps area, I'm trying to sell this idea to C-level. What is your recommendation? Like my approach right now is utilizing compliance, trying to be smart, SOC 2 Type 2, ISO 27001. We need this kind of stuff, but what do you recommend would be a smart way to get buy-in at the C-level that may or may not have the knowledge or understanding of what we're trying to achieve with such a program?
I think the C-level still gets like broad news about security. And I think using relevant news stories to talk about how that can affect you is a really convincing way. And if there's one person that you feel like is more tuned in on security, relying on them to do the speaking for you. I would often find like, I was doing this project as an L2, so like a role level security engineer, and folks didn't trust my title at Twilio. And so I did have to rely on other leaders to encourage others. I think that's like a pretty like dramatic example of using other folks, but sometimes it's knowing when you're gonna let others speak for you because they're gonna do a better job because they have the alliances to build that trust.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Please join me to thanking our guest, Ariel.